Over how the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee got his scoop about surveillance. But tonight, we know where he got it. This is Special Report. Good evening. I'm Shannon Bremen for Bret Baier. It appeared to be business as usual this morning for President Trump as he hosted a roundtable of female business owners. The meeting came after a weekend of reassessment and blame fixing following Friday's withdrawal of a House bill to repeal and replace Obamacare. And it occurred as there are more questions swirling around the head of the House Intelligence Committee and last week's big announcement about surveillance. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts begins our coverage tonight. Good evening, John.
Shannon, good evening to you. It was a startling revelation that was unveiled today. The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Nunes, used evidence to help back up the president's claim that he was wiretapped through a secret visit that he made to the White House last week. It's unclear whether the White House knew House Intelligence Chairman Nunes was at the White House complex the day before he revealed Trump transition officials had been swept up in intelligence gathering. Nunes had been viewing classified documents in a secure facility at the National Security Council. In a statement, Nunes' spokesman said, quote, Chairman Nunes met with his source at the White House grounds in order to have proximity to a secure location where he could view the information provided by the source. The information comprised executive branch documents that have not been provided to Congress. Because of classification rules, the source could not simply put the documents in a backpack and walk them over to the House Intelligence Committee space. Nunes says his source was an intelligence official, not a White House staffer, and that the information was contained on the executive branch computer system. The White House dismissed any notion that what Nunes did was unusual or improper.
We've asked both of these entities, both the House and the Senate Intelligence Committees, to undertake this review. So it is partially at our request that they're looking into this. He has said, from my understanding on the record, that he did not meet with White House staff.
Democrats had a different take. The ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee called Nunes' sleuthing suspicious. The Senate Minority Leader proclaimed he has to go.
If Speaker Ryan wants the House to have a credible investigation, he needs to replace Chairman Nunes.
The president today said nothing about the Nunes revelations, working instead to get past the stinging failure of his health care plan on Friday, signing bills to roll back Obama-era regulations on education, labor laws, and land use.
I will keep working with Congress, with every agency, and most importantly with the American people, until we eliminate every unnecessary, harmful, and job-killing regulation that we can find.
Last week, the White House proclaimed that the president was moving on from health care to tax cuts. But today, the press secretary said, well, maybe health care isn't dead just yet.
We're not saying it's the end of health care, but I think that we are looking to look for a way forward. And I think that a lot of the members, and again, on both sides of the aisle, have reached out not just to the president, but to members of the team, willing to share some ideas and both that will they think that would make the bill stronger. But ultimately, the goal is to get to 216 and potentially 218.
With conservatives still in opposition to the health care bill, the White House is reaching out to moderate Democrats for support, though any plan to repeal and replace Obamacare would likely be a non-starter. The White House also today announced a plan to streamline and make more efficient the operation of the federal government, appointing the first son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to head up the new Office of American Innovation. The White House also said that Kushner may soon be making a trip to Capitol Hill to talk with members of the Senate Intelligence Committee about his conversations with Russian officials and other foreign nationals during the transition. Shannon?
We will talk about that with the panel. John Roberts, live from the White House. Thank you. Well, the blame game is providing Republicans with their very own version of March Madness tonight. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel has that part of the story from Capitol Hill.
Further consideration of H.R. 1628 is postponed.
After House leadership was forced to pull the Republican health care proposal due to a lack of support, the blame game quickly launched.
The president's disappointed in a number of people that he thought were loyal to him that weren't.
President Trump took turns blaming Democrats and then the conservative House Freedom Caucus and outside conservative groups.
So I think he's being ill-advised about even the critique of the House Freedom Caucus. He's been getting bad bad counsel from the media, from some in leadership who said that some of us should not even exist up here.
The White House budget director, a founding member of the Freedom Caucus, took aim in this way.
I think there's probably plenty of blame to go around. As we sat over the last 2 days and tried to figure out what happened, I think what happened is that Washington won.
Texas Congressman Ted Poe quit the Freedom Caucus in frustration.
But no matter what changes were made, the goalposts kept getting moved. The Freedom Caucus decided that no was going to be the answer, and I think at some time we're going to have to say, yes, we are in power, we need to lead.
After some began accusing the group of saving funding for Planned Parenthood and keeping Obamacare, the group's leader talked about his role.
Well, I mean, at this particular point, I can tell you no one has been more self-critiquing than me. I can tell you, as I've looked at all of this, I said, could I have spent a little bit more time? Should I have spent more time with the Tuesday group, more time with Democrats to find some consensus?
With pressure on that group of lawmakers, a key member tried to move things forward.
So let's get back to work. Let's not blame people. Let's get back to work and do what the American people sent us here to do, which is repeal this law.
After this repeal and replace effort failed, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham received a hostile reception at a town hall. It was mostly Democrats attacking Graham, and he challenged the crowd to bring it on when he's up for re-election in 2020.
There may be a lot more yelling by the president and top leaders here on Capitol Hill if the next items on the agenda get stopped by more infighting. After all, the first 100 days is when you're supposed to be able to get cooperation to get things done. Shannon?
Yeah, not so much this time. Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, Senate Democrats are delaying a Judiciary Committee vote on Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch. It was supposed to happen today. It's been rescheduled for next Monday. So far, at least 17 Senate Democrats and independents have announced their opposition to the president's nominee. So for President Trump and Republicans, the big question is, how do they put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Senior political analyst Bret Baier is here tonight with some thoughts on that. Good evening, Bret.
Hi, Shannon. Well, it's not at all clear to me that they can put it back together again. The damage from this action on Friday and the failure of this bill to pass is likely to be quite long-lasting for a couple of reasons. One is that one of the things this bill would have done, had they managed to pass it and eventually get it through the Senate, was that it would have created some budget space, which is under Congress's arcane budget rules, is necessary when you're trying to legislate on taxes, which is supposed to be the next thing up. And this bill had some budget savings in it, which were significant enough to make it much easier to do tax reform, because the worry about tax reform always is you're going to reduce some taxes and you're going to try to come out in such a way that you don't add to the deficit. That's hard to do. If you have some budget savings as a result of another bill, as this was, it makes the job much easier. So this job, just as a practical matter, becomes much harder. Not to mention the fact that it's not at all clear that the Republican caucus, with this rump group that seems determined to say no to almost anything, which has been true for some years now, I might add, is not a dependable ally. So the job going forward for the next thing becomes much harder. Not to mention, Shannon, the fact that when you do tax reform, you're going to gore some oxes. There are going to be special interest groups that are going to lose their tax breaks, and they're going to lobby Washington to beat the band. On top of that, of course, is the fact that you're not going to get much, if any, Democratic support. So you've got to kind of try to do this with Republican votes only, or almost exclusively. That's tough. So this road ahead is hard, and it's just been made harder.
Well, Bret, do you see any historical context for this, how presidents in the past have faced something similar and managed to get the band back together?
Well, I'm trying to think of a time when a president with his first item on his agenda, the top item on the agenda, has failed this spectacularly and this early. And I frankly can't think of one. I think it's almost unprecedented. And I think that I'll say this about it that's worth mentioning. I think the president evidenced something that some might have not thought him capable, and that is he clearly got the complexities of trying to legislate on an issue like this. And you remember he said he never realized that health care could be so complicated. I think he figured it out, and I think he also understood the budget rules under which they were trying to operate, and necessarily had to. He seemed to get that too. He also seemed smart enough to recognize where the blame lay. He blamed Democrats. Well, their opposition was a given, I think, Shannon, but but he was also wise enough to see, I think, that the votes of the House Freedom Caucus, which he should have been able to depend on and couldn't, were a huge factor here. So the president seems to be learning as he goes, and he's not going to give up. He never has. So maybe he can find a way forward, but it won't be easy.
Yeah, you mentioned one of the big things they're going to have to tackle next, which of course what they're trying to do is tax reform. I thought it was interesting that the Freedom Caucus chair, Representative Mark Meadows, said he didn't necessarily need to see them as being revenue neutral, that there didn't have to be specific offsets. It sounds a little less conservative than the position they had on health care. Does that make you think they might be able to get that done?
Well, yeah, but the conservative view is not to add to the deficit. So now what we have here is the guy saying, and look, and remember this, that you can't just pass this through the House. You have to also consider what's going to happen in the Senate. You're not going to get much help from Democrats on this in all likelihood if you're going to pass a conservative version of tax reform. So they have to consider something that could be put through the Senate under the budget process. And there are lots of rules attached to that have to do with spending and taxation and the deficit. So for him to say airily, as he apparently did, that, well, we don't need to worry about that, that's wrong. You do have to worry about that if you're going to legislate in this arena. But this is what we're dealing with here. There's a sort of a pie-in-the-sky quality to what a lot of these members in that group seem to favor. They're always in favor of some bill other than the one before them, or some bill that couldn't be passed if it were brought to the floor. That's not going to get you anywhere.
Mm-hmm. All right, Bret Hume, always good to have your insights. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. You bet.
In New York tonight, activists are holding what is being billed as the first ever national conference on sanctuary cities. It comes as there is a new call tonight from the White House to end the practice of providing legal shelter to illegal immigrants. Senior correspondent Rick Leventhal tells us the administration is once again using the power of the purse to try to persuade.
I strongly urge our nation's states and cities and counties to consider carefully the harm they are doing.
At the same time, Attorney General Jeff Sessions spoke about the danger of sanctuary cities. The first ever national conference in support of sanctuary cities was underway in New York City.
January 20th was a tragic day for our nation.
Organizers say they want to protect all immigrants, especially the undocumented, by crafting municipal policy to confront mass deportation and criminalization.
We are going to become this administration's worst nightmare.
The White House says there is ample evidence to support a crackdown, including allegations of rape of a high school girl in Rockville, Maryland, allegedly by 2 undocumented immigrants, and another illegal in New York accused of sexually assaulting a toddler.
DUIs, assaults, burglaries, drug crimes, gang rapes, crimes against children, and murderers. Countless Americans would be alive today, and countless loved ones would not be grieving today if these policies of sanctuary cities were ended.
He could not be more wrong. He could not be more inaccurate and unable to actually see the realities that play in our cities and our states.
Mark Krikorian with the Center for Immigration Studies says otherwise.
Ironically, sanctuary cities are taking the immigration law into their own hands in a way that is actually both illegal and counterproductive to broader public safety goals.
For cities that don't come around to the Trump administration's position, the cost could be high.
We continue a dialogue and a discussion, and as we continue to ensure that monies that go for law enforcement only go to cities who are participating in an effective, collegial, cooperative way.
Well, organizers of the conference supporting sanctuary cities say it would be illegal for the White House to withhold funds from places that don't comply with the law. But the administration says it can and it will, setting up the possibility of more court battles over Trump policy. This conference resumes here tomorrow morning, Shannon.
All right, Rick, thank you very much. It is not just Democrats and immigration advocates who are trying to stop President Trump from building that wall along the Mexican border. People who live there right now are planning to fight the seizure of their property. Correspondent Casey Stiegel explains from Dallas tonight.
It was a cornerstone of President Trump's campaign, erect a wall between Mexico and the United States to keep illegal immigrants and smugglers out.
And who's going to stop them?
Not me, not you, nor Trump.
Aurora Mirta may be skeptical over how much of a deterrent the structure will actually be. She and her family own land along the border in South Texas, and they've now received a letter from the Department of Justice offering $2,900 for more than 1 acre of their property. Fair market value says the federal government not even close, say the Mirtas, for land that has been in the family for generations.
I don't think it's fair. We are 58 grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we're going to be getting about $50 per cousin.
Legal scholars say this is just one example out of possibly thousands where the feds will have to exercise eminent domain to snatch up private border property to build on.
It can be scary, it can be intimidating, it can be emotional.
Attorney Luke Ellis specializes in eminent domain law. He says the Lone Star State is unique and predicts many here will put up a fight.
About 98% of land in Texas is privately owned. It means that a whole bunch of property owners are going to have to give up quite a bit of acreage in order to build this wall.
Republicans have typically spoken out against the use of eminent domain, citing government overreach. President Trump, however, has seen it differently, mostly advocating for its use and defending it, including in this October 2015 interview with our own Bret Baier.
Now, just so you understand, you're not taking the house. You're taking the house and paying much more. No, you're paying much more than it's worth.
Even if they don't want to sell.
Even if they don't want to sell, you're taking a payment. Now, it depends on what. If it's to build another house for somebody else who has more money, absolutely not.
And back out here live in Dallas tonight, legal experts tell us that landowners will not be able to fight the merits of an eminent domain case since the border wall has been deemed public use. What can be contested in court, however, what is fair market value and how much should the check be for people who turn over their land? Shannon?
Yeah, that can take a lot of time in the courts. Casey Stiegel, thank you. A British counterterrorism official says there is no evidence last week's Westminster attacker was associated with the Islamic State or al-Qaeda. The official says the 52-year-old man clearly had an interest in jihad, but there's no indication he discussed his plans with others. ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack. Police continue to question 2 other men detained since the attack, which left 4 people dead. More American troops are headed to the fight against ISIS. Pentagon producer Lucas Tomlinson tells us how many and where they're going.
U.S. defense officials tell Fox 2 companies from the 82nd Airborne Division based at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, some 200 troops in all, will be departing soon for the ISIS fight in Mosul. This comes days after the USS George H.W. Bush entered the Persian Gulf to begin airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The Pentagon is also ramping up operations against terrorist groups around the world, with increasing focus on the African continent. U.S. officials tell Fox the Department of Homeland Security's recent ban on electronic devices larger than cell phones on flights to the United States from some Muslim nations was imposed in part because a laptop was used to bomb this Somali airliner last year. Al-Shabaab, al-Qaeda's affiliate in Somalia, claimed responsibility for the attack. And the top U.S. general for Africa says the terror group could strike again in the future.
I think Al-Shabaab has demonstrated they could do this in the past, so I think it's something that we just continue to watch and have to stay after.
This increasing terrorist threat from al-Shabaab is one of the reasons General Waldhauser recently asked the new administration for greater authority to strike al-Qaeda's 3rd largest affiliate on his own terms.
I think the combatant commanders, myself included, are more than capable of making judgments and determinations on some of these targets, and I'm well capable, and we are all well capable of making those calls.
General Waldhauser recently told Congress al-Shabaab regained territory last year and today continues to carry out attacks on U.S.-backed African forces and Western hotels in the capital, Mogadishu. 3,000 miles north of Somalia, ISIS remains a nagging problem with up to 200 fighters regrouping in southern Libya, requiring the continued presence of U.S. Special Operations Forces on the ground to help with future airstrikes.
ISIS has not left. We're going to keep a presence on the ground because you have to have that there. And we're going to develop intelligence and take out targets when they arise.
In January, a pair of Air Force B-2 bombers flew a 30-hour round-trip mission from Missouri to Libya to destroy 2 ISIS training camps following hundreds of drone strikes against the terrorist group in the Libyan coastal city of Sirte since August. Officials say ISIS has begun to appear in Somalia, but General Waldhauser says the terrorist group is no longer coming to Libya in large numbers anymore, following 5 months of airstrikes against them. Shannon?
Lucas Tomlinson tonight at the Pentagon. Thank you. The Associated Press says North Carolina's law limiting transgender bathroom access will cost the state more than $3.75 billion in lost business over a dozen years. That's despite Republican assurances that the so-called bathroom bill is not hurting the economy. Several large companies backed out of projects because of the law. Dozens of sporting events, concerts, and conventions were canceled. Still, other measures show North Carolina has a healthy economy, estimated at more than $500 billion a year. The state's Republican lieutenant governor says news outlets are exaggerating the economic impact of the law. Well, stocks rebounded this afternoon after big losses in the morning. The Dow ended up losing 46. The S&P 500 dropped 2. NASDAQ gained 12. Who is winning? Who's losing? The blame game following the health care failure for the president and Republicans. We will ask the panel after a quick break.
Remember our mission statement. We talk about the countless number of families who feel like this town has forgotten them.
I got the opinion that there's some members of the Freedom Caucus, they'd vote no against the 10 Commandments if it came up for a vote.
I don't think we've seen the end of health care. The further along we go, where premiums continue to go up, more and more people will be drawn into this discussion.
Next up, we're going to get back to the president's 3-part agenda. Jobs, jobs, and jobs.
You need 60 votes in the Senate to do anything, including a bathroom break. I would recommend they pivot to infrastructure now.
Oh boy, let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard. Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Welcome to all of you. There's a lot going on in Washington. All right, Steve, you heard a lot of different topics touched on there. I want to bring up something, though. There was a tweet from the president this weekend. This is from the real Donald Trump account. Democrats are smiling in D.C. that the Freedom Caucus, with the help of Club for Growth and Heritage, have saved Planned Parenthood and Obamacare. Now, if they're going to get to the rest of this agenda and all the other things they have to do, they got to kiss and make up at some point.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen in fits and starts from virtually everybody involved is taking shots at one another and then making up or trying to make nice, while a lot of that taking place behind the scenes. Look, I mean, I think if you're looking for who to blame on what happened, the answer is everyone. I mean, the answer is the president, the answer is the House leadership, the answer is the Freedom Caucus. Now, I happen to be very sympathetic to the substantive arguments that the Freedom Caucus made, and I share their disappointment that the original bill wasn't more free market and didn't push more aggressively toward the kind of real reforms I think that we need in our health care system. But certainly it's the case that if Republicans don't, A, decide to make up and work together, and B, get health care back on the agenda, it will be a broken promise from Republicans of historic proportions.
And Chuck, Sean Spicer, among many others, Reince Priebus and others have said it's not gone away. There are a number of members of the Freedom Caucus, too, saying this healthcare fight is not over. It's going to come back at some point. But they're barreling forward with other things like tax reform that they want to get done as well. Where do you think healthcare re-bubbles up to the surface? Does it?
Well, I thought Paul Ryan just said it's here for the foreseeable future. So once again, it's not even clear that everybody has the same sense of reality in this party. I don't think there's ever been a time in our history where there's been one party that was simultaneously totally dominant in American politics and totally incoherent within itself. And no, I don't expect, maybe there's some talk about like revisiting healthcare and this and that. I don't really expect that. I think maybe wrongly, but I think rightly, I expect them to pivot to tax reform and try and make a run at that. And when they do, they're going to have to be much more deliberate and much more careful about, before they launch some bill, make sure that they've really got everybody on side. Problem, of course, is the Freedom Caucus, as Mr. Poe said, they might vote against anything, even the 10 Commandments.
Well, and that's why, Molly, I want to play a little bit from the chair of the Freedom Caucus, Mark Meadows, who was talking this weekend about this idea of tax reform, because a lot of people think they're going to be hardliners. It's going to be tough to get them on board. But here's what he said about making this revenue neutral or not.
tax reform and lowering taxes, will create and generate more income. And so we're looking at those, where the fine balance is, but does it have to be fully offset? My personal response is no.
So he's not speaking for the caucus there, but he sounds like they're not going to be as, line drawn in the sand and that's it, and we're not coming across.
Well, it is interesting. They said that the whole reason you had to do health care originally was so that you would get these budget savings that you could then apply to tax reform. And now they're just going ahead with tax reform. Although, to be fair, you can work it either way, and there are so many gains to be made through tax reform that maybe he just wants to focus on that. Having said that, there really is an issue of health reform needs to happen. They might say they're done with health care reform, insurance reform, but it's certainly not done with them. And this legislation really is a failure, and insurance companies will continue to leave, and millions of people will continue to suffer. So whether or not they want to be done with it, it has to be dealt with.
Well, Charles, how do you see that playing out in 2018, this inability of the GOP controlling the White House, Senate, and House and promising for 7 years and running against this on a repeal? If they don't do anything beyond what happened on Friday, what happens when 2018 rolls around? And if by their prediction, the system under Obamacare is that much worse and Americans are in even worse shape?
I think it's ruinous. It's not just a promise betrayed. It's a complete inability to govern, particularly when you've been arguing for something for 7 years. It arrives and you are then unprepared. So that's why I think it has to come back. And I think the time it comes back is in the fall, when you get the new numbers, the new premiums coming out. They're going to be much higher, going to be fewer choices, far more. Insurers are going to be withdrawing from the exchanges, and they are going to be in a state of collapse. At that point, I think that there'll be an opportunity. And I think what they have to do, here's the irony. I think among the Republicans in the House, including the Freedom Caucus, there would have been a general consensus on what we would want to do. But the leadership decided to tailor the legislation to fit the niceties of the reconciliation rules in the Senate. That makes no sense at all. Put everything in the bill, including what's called the phase 3 stuff that was supposed to come later, the stuff that the conservatives want, that everybody really wants, including tort reform, including stripping out the coverage requirements, which are largely irrational. Put all that in the bill, and if it turns out that in the Senate it needs 60, well, it'll be the Democrats who have to filibuster and let the country watch them deny them a reform of a collapsing system. That seems to me the logical way to go. You may have to wait till the fall, but that's what they ought to do.
All right, I want to make sure that we touch on the issue with the House Intelligence Chairman Devin Nunes as well, with the revelation today that he apparently went to the White House to see whatever the sourcing was from the documents that he is referencing. I want to play a little bit of what Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer had to say.
His actions look like those of someone who is interested in protecting the president and his party, and that doesn't work when the goal of the committee is to investigate Russia and its connection to the president and his campaign.
Here's a bit of what a spokesperson for Congressman or Chairman Nunes said. He said he met with his source at the White House grounds in order to have proximity to a secure location where he could view the information provided by the source. Because of classification rules, the source could not simply put the documents in a backpack, walk them over to the House Intelligence Committee space. The White House grounds was the best location to safeguard the proper chain of custody and classification of those documents so the chairman could view them in a legal way. Molly.
Exactly. Representative Nunes explained that there was no place on Capitol Hill where he could view these documents. He had to view them in an executive branch computer. It sounds like he has a whistleblower who's actually trying to follow through what the proper rules are for getting this information. The other interesting thing that Nunes said today is that this information wasn't just widely disseminated to intelligence agencies, but back to the Obama White House. If that's true, we have further evidence that we have the makings of a big scandal, one that needs investigation, not just the probe with Russia, but how much the Obama administration was surveilling Trump and his associates.
Well, Chuck, you know that the Democrats are going to make hay of this and point to, hey, it's coming from inside the White House. What was it? Who was he seeing? Already, they're really tackling the PR side of this.
But let us assume that Devin Nunes had to look at these in the White House. It was the only secure place. The problem is still that once he got this information, his first move was to go tell the president, was to go over to the White House and talk about it with Donald Trump, as opposed to, I don't know, the members of his committee.
First, he told the press, actually. He told the American people.
Take your pick. I mean, he's supposedly running a serious investigation of intelligence matters. And I think the damage, what you read this talk about like it was the only proper place, is just damage control. The damage is significant.
Look, Nunes has a reputation, a well-deserved reputation of being sort of a dog with a bone on intelligence issues, and in a couple previous issues, it's worked to the advantage, I think, of the country. He's exposed things on Benghazi that we never would have seen but for his work. The same is true with the Osama bin Laden documents. The question here is what are the documents? I mean, what does he have? I just don't think we know enough about what he has to draw any firm conclusions about whether it is or is not, whether this is the scandal that Molly suggests it is, or whether it's, the scandal that Democrats suggest it is. I think we need to learn a lot more before we can draw firm conclusions.
All right, so we'll have to stay tuned. And we hope you'll stay tuned, because the panel's coming back. Next up, trouble in Russia and more American troops headed to the Middle East. Stay with us.
The United States strongly condemns the detention of hundreds of peaceful protesters throughout Russia on Sunday. The detention of peaceful protesters, human rights observers, and journalists is an affront to essential democratic values. The United States will monitor the situation, and we call on the government of Russia to immediately release all peaceful protesters.
The Kremlin respects people's civic stance and their right to voice their position. We can't express the same respect to those who consciously misled people and who consciously did it yesterday and provoked illegal actions.
All right, we are back with our panel, and let's start with Russia for this foreign policy round. Charles, more than 1,000 people in Moscow alone apparently were arrested in these protests yesterday, anti-corruption, anti-Putin. They don't take kindly to protests in Russia.
No, this is a malign regime, and the statement by the White House was a fairly mild one. But think about what just happened in the last couple of days. Last Thursday, a Kremlin opponent who took refuge in the Ukraine, he's against the Ukraine operation, was shot dead in the street, broad daylight. 2 days earlier, a week ago on Tuesday, another critic of the regime who represents the Magnitsky family, another guy who died on orders of the Kremlin, he falls out of a 4-story window when, according to the regime, while installing a hot tub in a 4th-floor apartment. Now, I don't know about Russia, but in the United States, installing hot tubs is not a known cause of defenestration. So this is a little bit suspicious. And we have a president who talks about this guy, who is a killer. We're talking about Putin here. He kills his opponents. There are at least a dozen who are well known, and speaks about it flippantly. This is a guy, look, it doesn't mean you start a world war with this guy. It doesn't mean that you have to oppose everything he does. But this is a regime of which the Trump administration has spoken very mildly. And I think it's an affront to our values. It's also against our interest. There are Europeans, like the leading candidate for president in France, who was just in Moscow. She smoked a peace pipe with Putin. She spoke glowingly of him. This is Russia extending its influence in a way that will be very much detrimental to us and to the West.
And yet he maintains a more than 80% approval rate. In Russia, Molly.
Yes, I mean, there really is a difference in how Russia handles things. It is important that you speak out against brutal authoritarian regimes, and the State Department did condemn what happened in Russia. You have other U.S. leaders like Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska, who issued a strongly worded statement. At the same time, when it comes to foreign policy, you should be laser focused on what's in the national interest. And we work with brutal regimes all the time, whether that's China or Saudi Arabia, places with horrible human rights problems, and Russia is no different. In terms of what our relationship should be with them, it should be based on what our interests are and whether we can strategically ally with them or whether we need to watch our guard. That's what diplomacy is all about.
Yeah, and on the topic of Russia, Chuck, today word that Jared Kushner, of course the president's son-in-law, has volunteered and / was also asked to speak with the Senate Intelligence Committee about contacts that he's had with various Russian leaders and businessmen and other folks.
My head is sort of spinning, actually, at this point, because we have this idea over here that somehow there was collusion between Trump campaign and Putin on the one hand, and then on the other hand you have Sean Spicer from the podium, wagging his finger and denouncing the Putin regime in pretty strong terms, probably as strong as anything Obama would have said. I guess I was struck by that because it wasn't just coming from the State Department, now it's coming out of the White House. And I think there was something conscious about that there would have been tremendous embarrassment to President Trump under the current circumstances if his White House had remained completely silent about what was going on over there. Remember, this is a president who during recent history said, well, you know, we kill a lot of people too, when somebody told him that Putin was a killer. And so it's possible that events, quite unforeseen events over there in Russia, may actually be somehow forcing the Trump administration off of the position that the president himself seemed to want to stake out when he was running.
Steve, do you make anything of Jared Kushner now going to talk with them? I mean, you know, we saw Devin Nunes, chairman on the House side, saying we want people to come forward, we want whistleblowers to come forward on any number of fronts, and several have now volunteered, right. and now it appears on the Senate side that'll be Jared Kushner. Well, it's progress. I mean, I think we need to learn more about that part of this discussion to pick up on where we were in the last panel as well. There's so much speculation taking place right now with so few people looking at this through soda straws. It's like trying to describe a 5,000-piece puzzle with 8 pieces. You can't do it. So we need to get more information. I think that information has to come out in public hearings, far preferable than private hearings. And we know as all of this is happening, the FBI is conducting its own investigation. And on another front, we heard today from our own Lucas Tomlinson reporting from the Pentagon, 200 U.S. troops now heading over into Mosul. It's an ugly fight there, Charles, but they say they're making progress.
Yeah, and we have the usual story about the civilian casualties, which are always exaggerated, played up. It can happen. It does happen. This is warfare inside of a city. ISIS does this deliberately because it knows the effect it has. In the end, the Iraqis are going to succeed, and there will be a wasteland will be left of Mosul. But the question is, who goes in afterwards? Who patrols it? Is it going to be the Kurds? Is it going to be the government dominated by the Shiite militias? This is a largely Sunni city. Is it going to be the Sunnis? I don't know how many there are. Is it going to be us? It was us for a while when until Obama pulled us out. We were the mediators between the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds, and Mosul was secure. So there's a whole new world where the easy part is conquering the city. The hard part is governing it and maintaining it. Yeah, and how, Molly, do you think this administration may handle that differently than the last administration?
Well, that's what's kind of interesting is it seems a lot of Donald Trump's appeal was that he did have a different idea about foreign policy, a more restrained approach to when and where the U.S. would be involved in other countries. And here you have a situation where it looks like, once again, we'll be involved pretty heavily here. But it speaks again to why it's important to work with allies and other people. Russia would be a great ally to deal with the situation in Syria and in the whole region. And it would be nice to have some better relations with them at this time.
But the problem is that Russia is not an ally in the region. Its interests are entirely inimical to American interests, and its number one interest is to kick us out. That's why we can't get a policy going in which we are allies with them.
All right, we got to leave it there. Panel, but stick around. Thanks for watching Special Report. I'm Shannon Bream. Good night from Washington. The first 100 days with Martha McCallum is up next.